a challenge to see your professor. So we're gonna have a lot of fun this week. We're gonna be talking about representation, Native people, and obviously, but we're gonna be exploring it as it's coming through film. And the article that we're gonna be looking at. Let me get the exact title for you. It's oops, I jumped down page. Um, John Wayne's Teeth: Speech, Sound, and Representation, Smoke Signals, and Imagining Indians by Joanna Hare. I'm sorry, Harney. And when was this published? Let me get the exact publishing date for you. Oh, fall 2025. And it was done in uh, where is it? Oh yeah, the Western Folklore. And that's a really credible journal, by the way. It was I remember spending a lot of years reading a bunch of stuff from them, and even subscribing to them for a little bit of time. Um, but this one's going to be kind of fun. If you don't know Smoke Signals, it would be totally worth and behoove you to go and watch it. Not during the week, but at some point in time. It's it literally it's you don't want to say cult classic when it comes to native films. You might just say it's a historic classic, and terminology is going to be big this week. Okay, and I'll just let you know, this is going to be nice because I get to dust off all of my film studies and film analytical prowess that I used to get into and delve with. I got into that a lot much more than musology, the study of museums, and working along that line. Dealing with native art, that was kind of a big representation, and film media and music in particular, because the image and sound are so intricately connected in a very particular and not mutually exclusive way, although you can look at them from a mutually exclusive position. But when you do so, you actually then um, you disassociate a portion of the representation, the meaning, and so having them connected is a very very big deal. Excuse me. And a lot of my work coming originally from sound, from the sonic arts, the sonic expressive arts and music. Having to deal with sound and image, was really kind of critical. So this is going to be a lot of fun. And going through the article again, there's some very interesting points and things that are going to be dropped along the line. So we're hitting a good place. One of the things to really, 'cause like I said, we're going to be dealing with a lot of vernacular. Okay, and so one of the very first terms that we kind of need to unpackage, and I'm going to be dropping a lot of theories on you and a lot of current theories and such that I've been working on, and this is going to be a really strong test model for my theories because right now they would just be hypotheses. So this is actually going to make them theoretical foundations this week. So thank you for pushing me out of my own comfort zone and whatnot. But as we start taking a look at the very beginning of this article on page 2, it says here, quote, "The emergence of independent indigenous film and video raises important questions about the relationship between folklore and film, and between indigenous minority filmmaking and dominant, especially Hollywood, systems, representations, and genres. How do films that contain folklore differ from films in which the oral narrative structure or organized not only the dramatic content but also the film's production? How do native controlled films and videos reinvent the idea of tradition and in the process reframe discourses about authenticity in popular culture? How do acts of telling, recording, and dramatizing oral narratives on film relate mutually to the project of cultural revitalization through the work of stories and storytelling?" All right, that's it. That first paragraph, that's like a master's thesis, in and of itself. And the first thing we have to look at is, oh man, why did I do that? The first thing we need to look at is their use is I'm sorry is her use of folklore. Okay, folklore. Let's tear that one apart right away. Folk, meaning from the people, lore meaning like a legend or a story. Okay, This is begats the problem, and I've been writing about this, and I did a big article on it recently, and I've been exploring it as well, and tearing apart storytelling and not making it one word, but story hyphen telling. I have a problem with the word story, and I have a repositioning in the way of understanding telling. Um, And what's interesting about this article, and she's very upfront of it, she comes at this from an objectified other's position. She's not a native person. She's very upfront about that. She says so in like what, like page 3 or something like that. She mentions it. So she has to take a different perspective, which is very credible for her to kind of admit and to bring up. I give the author credit for that one, because when you look at things from an indigenous reading, you're going to have a different sense and take on it. So the fact that she's using vernacular, that's why this week is going to be so much fun. Because as a native person, I'm going to be giving you the reading that I'm going to give is going to be coming from an indigenous native perspective. And it's going to be a discourse and a reading and analysis of the article. So your responsibility, you're going to love this one. is kind of twofold. You get to balance and have a lot of fun with it. So your responses to this, your analysis, should be just like really chock full of a lot of content. And I say that because some people have just kind of been flirting with danger with some of the representations that they've been putting out there, the analyses. And so this is the chance for you to really kind of show that you're really kind of stepping up to the plate and taking note of what's going on, because you get to balance and see what it is that the author's talking about, and you can write a response and analysis specifically from that point. You could take a collection of all of the things that I'm going to be presenting to you and juxtaposing them with what she's saying, and then you can write an analysis from your understanding of what it is that I'm dropping on you from critical indigenous theoretical perspectives. Or, well, I guess that would be the only two ways of doing it, because if you totally discredit it, then you're not doing a proper analysis, period. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But first of all, we have to tear apart folklore. Okay, when non-native people talk about and use the terminology of folklore, what they are doing is compartmentalizing, reducing, minimizing, and putting a diminutive visibility and relationship on the native expressive arts. When I say native expressive arts, pay very close attention to that term. It's because I'm encapsulating anything that's going to have an expressive relationship. That's dance, that's theater, that's literature, that's music, that's film, that's medium, that's videos, that's in this day and age, it's even social posting. So any and all of these things are the expressive arts, and as well as visual arts. I mean, that goes in textiles and working. So it's it's going to be all of these representations together. And then the expressive arts also can be read from a historic position as well as a contemporary position. Now, I don't use the word storytelling. Really moving away from those. I would rather and prefer narrative and historical narrative, and the narrative histories that are there, that are involved. And I can't believe I'm even saying this. I actually am going to be rubbing up and presenting to you a lot of the challenges that I have with one of my famed heroes, Stuart Hall. She brings him up, and I love Stuart Hall. I mean, he really helped me get through some very, long, lonely hours. I can't tell you how many days I spent, at 24-hour burrito shops, sitting there, with the $3 that I had, buying, the biggest burrito I could, and a glass of water, and reading Stuart Hall, into the wee small hours of the morning, just to stay warm in these, places next to the kitchen. It's But what Stuart Hall says about identity, and he's part and parcel why I got him, and Homi Baba are part and parcel about why I got into identity construction, because I was really fascinated by the way that they presented and utilized it. But I read their stuff from an indigenous perspective. I don't read it from in Stuart Hall's perspective. It would be a post-colonial a representation, or from Homi Bhabha. Well, his is post-colonial as well, but he's also coming up from it from a subaltern perspective. Now, you remember post-coloniality. That means that you have to have a colonial doctrine and discourse that you're going to be rubbing up against in order for there to be something that's post. However, for post coloniality to exist, that means that the colonial doctrine discipline is still in place and intact. Because, and for Native people, there is no, for Native people who are reading histories from a decolonial perspective, there is no post coloniality. It doesn't exist because they dismantle, discredit, and do not give affordability to the social political hegemony that's been forced upon them through the assimilation processes, in the hegemonic assimilation structures and strategies. They just don't go there, because they see that their experiences, lived experiences, and histories are narrated by the rights of self-determination and using the famed colonial word sovereignty. Because sovereignty, I put that in quotes, bunny ears, right? Sovereignty has been not usurped. Usurped means that you're taking that you're overriding a power. It's a power overriding a power. Is that they have reassessed and repositioned sovereignty, a colonial term, to represent their rights of network relationships, social, political, religious expressions, cultural traditions, knowledge, traditional knowledge, and their interrelated multi-tribal relationships across the networks of indigeneity, and fair representation, lived experience representation, to mean their rights and ability to self-determine who they are. Because sovereignty did not exist as a term in the Americas until it was brought and imported over by European colonialism, right? So it didn't exist here. So for Native people to use it, and to use it very comfortably now, they've actually decolonized the term. You get me? And we got all this from folklore. Okay, so don't lose that. That's where we're still going there. We're still unpackaging that term. So with folklore, when people who are non-native use that, what they're trying to do is they're trying to compress all of these different structures and ways of looking at native people into a specific way that's almost built on a mythology of who their representation and understanding is from a folk position of native people. Meaning, they're reading native and indigeneity, or their Indianness, based upon their understandings of how they actually relate to themselves. How did they understand their own culture and identities? And that's how they're going to be reading tribal identities in Indianness. So it has to be a folk, it has to be a personal relationship, but it's a lore, it's a story. Okay, and then that story, and this begets the problem, is that as soon as you say that it's a story, it can be fictionalized, it can be disturbed, it can be distorted, it can be hyper realized, it can be completely hyper glamorized, supernatural. So it has all those positions and availability with it. So folklore, a story, a myth from the people, which is what it means. When you apply it to Native people, you're actually saying that this is how non-Native communities understand the stories of Native people from a non-Native perspective. That's what you're reading it as, okay? Because there is no such thing as folklore in Native reality. It doesn't exist. It's just called culture. It's your way of identifying yourselves. So that term was not there. Now she throws anthropology in front of it, anthropological folklore. It's like, oh my gosh, now we have to unpackage that. Okay, anthropology is the study of people, right? And anthropologic. Okay, pelagic, or polemics. It's so anthro is human, polemics, pelagic, how it is that they're evolved, their evolution. So when you put anthropology or anthropologic folklore together, it's a study of a people and their evolution through their representation of themselves by the act of storytelling. Did you catch all that? Anthropological folklore, when you really reduce it, is it's saying it's a study of a people through the evolution and the involvement that they have of their identity formation and construction through the act of storytelling. For Native people, that does not exist. For non Native people, or for Westerners studying Native cultures and identities, it works perfectly. Why? Because it gives you the liberty and the license to be able to study from what was started off as a distance to having a close proximity relationship to it, because you're saying that, oh, I'm trying to learn your quote story. Now, who is telling that story? It begets the other problem: storytelling. Native people like to use the word storytelling, and in certain contexts, that's useful. However, my argument is that the relationship and the understanding of when you use storytelling is specifically located and has a purpose for tribal representation in a tribal context, not on a, not on a level or means for Native people to be expressing their histories to the larger non-Native communities. Because as soon as you do, what happens? You're telling the Native people have to tell a story, but then they also have to contextualize that story. If you're telling your history, you can start with the and pinpoint a specific location in time that you can discuss and then relate that to a contemporary position. But once you tell a story, you have to give all of the subtext and all the surrounding environment. You have to give all of the context, weight, and baggage that comes with telling the story. And also, furthermore, when you divide it up, story, which is which becomes a fantastical element, telling. Western European doctrine doesn't like to be told anything, right? It's a power privileged position. So as soon as you're saying that, oh, we're storytelling, now it's in from a native perspective, it's they understand story. That's okay because that's a Disneyfication, right? We've already understand that you are a hyper mythical image, the Indian, which does not exist, but we gave you that identity through colonialism. But now you want to tell us something. No, you can share your story with us from a fantastical perspective when they bind it together as one word, storytelling. But if you break it apart, story hyphen telling, now Native people are trying to tell something. They're trying to tell and equate and relate what is going on from an Indigenous Native perspective. That doesn't really kind of sit well because Western hegemony, power, and privilege, superiority, supremacy rather, doesn't want to be told anything because they need to hold and retain a dominant position. Whereas Native people, and still in American pop cultural psychology, are looked at by most people are domestic dependents, subdominant, or at best they have a subaltern voice. Anytime you see that sub, it means it's lower than the dominant privileged perspective. Okay, and a subaltern means it's a subalternative voice that comes from Spivak. Yes, Gayatri Spivak, sorry, and her critical reading especially of women's identity in Southeast Asia and in India, in noting that there's a classist structure that's there. Native people are not even on they're not even on the classist structure. I mean, they're so low down, so diminutively, represented on that cultural ladder in American popular psychology. Okay, because remember the image of the Indian is a fantastical represented image by Western colonial discourse. So storytelling from that perspective works perfectly. From an Indigenous perspective, I argue that it doesn't work. It doesn't. Because once you're storytelling, what you're having to do is you're creating a situation in which you have to explain and go through not only the story, but then you also have to equate how it relates to you as a native person. Then you have to put that in context to the position and the space and place in which you're occupying, in which the story is being occupied. And all this time you're telling this, to a Western European ear? Are they going to spend that much time? I mean, look, there's a reason I limit, even our conversations that we have here, because I know most people don't even have that kind of attention span. you know I mean, modern psychology says that we have a 3 minute and 43 second attention span at most. The record company loves that because 3 minutes and 33 seconds was exactly the amount of time it took for a track to be played on the air. So we've reduced that. Now, hyper hyper compress that, concentrate it in a digital social media world, you got 15 to 20 seconds to make your claim. That's not even time for an elevator pitch. At least in an elevator pitch, you have a minute and a half, to say something. You got 1 minute to make your pitch here, at most a minute and a half. And that's why, when most of you are like doing your posts, that's why you only have 30 seconds. Do you notice this? You're posting at 30 seconds, 45 seconds, or 60 seconds. Some of them go up to 90 seconds. That's your elevator pitch. That's like, hyper glory. And then I guess, if you go on Facebook, you get up to 3 minutes, right? If you can deal with it that way. But how many of you are actually going to sit around and listen to 3 minutes of a reel? You know, I mean, come on. You want it in the first 15 to 20 seconds. That's just the way we've been told. So, for storytelling from an indigenous perspective, especially in a modern context, it begats a really strong problem because you're having to unfold and tell all the concentrated, sorry, you have to unpackage what a Western ear would like to have concentrated. That's where I'm going. They need to unpackage what would be concentrated for a Western ear to understand as a viable way of representation. However, all those layers that relate, the story, okay, if I'm going to use storytelling as the language here, the storytelling, its understanding, its relationship to native and non-native cultures, its position in history, a native history, its location in the space and place and where the story is being told, and now its contemporary relationship. That's at least 5 different layers that you have to explain out of one story. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So storytelling, however, in an indigenous space works perfectly because most of those levels, those layers, are already reduced. They're miniaturized because you don't need to go through and tell the context of everything. There's a certain sense of traditional knowledge that's invested that even when storytelling is being done, like for example, up in the Tlingit areas, up in um, the Pacific Northwest, I'm looking at like Seattle, those kind of areas, right? And with the potlatch and the potlatch, ceremonies that are going on, it's 7 days is the traditional ones. Okay, they've qualified it down to like contemporary ones would be like 3 or 4 days, but traditionally it's 7 days. And in those 7 days, there's storytelling that goes on. It's done through theater and music, right? It's dramatically played out. But what you're doing is when you're speaking to the tribe, that act of storytelling works because the tribal knowledge that's invested inside of there, you're telling and teaching to the younger generations, but there's context that's already related because it's coming from the cultural fabric. When native people try to story tell or impose the act of storytelling outside of that, now all those layers become amplified. You have to go through all those different layers. I don't like that. It just doesn't work. And so for me, storytelling from a native perspective, and specifically an indigenous one, this is my current theories, doesn't work and is not situated applicably for contemporary native identity representation. That's what this article is talking about. This article tackles and looks at the representation of Native people and identity through the act of film and filmmaking and its representation on the contemporary lens and status. That's why I've only stopped at the opening, paragraph. That one in and of itself, already, contextualized and it makes, brings up all these different problems that are there. Um, Going down, she gives you the argument about what it is that she's looking at, and then some representations of these. And I love the fact that it's on page 3. where she says, quote, following David James' interest in the relationship between film production and film text, and drawing from insights into post-colonial identity construction by Stuart Hall and Frantz Fanon, I outlined several ways that Indigenous filmmakers engage in, quote, passionate research by recontextualizing earlier images, text, oral narratives, and song. Now, do you notice that storytelling is not on that list? Yeah, that's what made me go happy, but I don't like post-coloniality being used inside of there. I would say rather that, but she can't read it from that perspective. She can read it from an outsider's understanding of decolonialism. Colonialism, but if I was writing this article, I would write it from a decolonial perspective because as a Native person, I have that layer of sensitivity to what the films are being expressed. So, for example, we're dealing with smoke signals, and don't worry, I'm going to put the excerpt of John Wayne's teeth in the notes so you can actually see it because it's hilarious. But like, check this one out. So, like when Smoke Signals first came out, I remember my mom and I were watching it with my pops, and and when the film finished, my mom and I just were our mouths were just like dropped open, and my dad said, what do you think? And my mom and I looked at each other, and we both looked at him, and my mom opened it up perfectly. She said, you know more about me now than I ever told you. And and he had like this blank look, like, what are you talking about? And I just, yeah, because you get it. There's stuff that's going on inside of there that a native person would understand and read. Chris Eyre's a native man, okay, and he's the one who filmmaked it. It comes from the writings of Sherman Alexie, who's a native person. So all of that flavor, that fragrance, that intent and importance of what it is to be a native person is embedded inside the narrative. It's telling a history, not a story. It's a history. When people read it as a story, you're already kind of getting the sense that, oh, okay, they're taking it and trying to, especially if a native person is using it. If I'm going to use storytelling to somebody else who's a non-native person, what I'm actually very politely doing is saying that you don't understand native history, so I have to tell you a story to open you up to what is the importance of native histories, because you just don't get it. But for narrative histories to be expressed, now you're talking about it from an indigenous perspective. She has to talk about it from a post-colonial identity and relationship because she's not a native person. So she has to, first of all, understand and articulate that colonialism exists. She has to try to talk about it then and saying that for Native people, post coloniality is a complicated issue. Building off of the work of Frantz Fanon and his pedagogical understanding of culture, and then Stuart Hall's development and relationship of identity construction, which he says, yes, predominantly that identity is fluid and is non-fixed. It is consistently under construction. Yes, finally somebody's like speaking my language. It's like, thank you, Dr. Hall. When it all comes from him anyways. I mean, I'm basing what I say, on the background of what he's saying. Him and Visner and et al. And Deloria, Philip, and Vine. I could just go on with the litany. Anyways, it's all, Jack Forbes, you know, John Mohawk, you know, Takake Alfred. Oh yeah. I mean, now we're talking, even Constable, John Constable, from, who's questionably a native guy, from Canada. Some of you, if told me you've read Kim Tallbear, I mean, get her to go. Linda Twally Smith, they're all saying the same thing just from different perspectives, but they're reading it from an indigenous and identity construction. So when they talk about things, they don't even have to use the term decoloniality or decolonialism because it's understood in the way it's being represented. When you're not a native person and you're trying to read decoloniality, you need to start with a position of post-coloniality to get to there, but you have to frame it on the backgrounds and the heels of what is indigenous discourse. If you don't, you're not moving into a decolonial perspective. So for native people, a decolonial storytelling is a way of actually dismantling, unpackaging, and interrogating an anthropological folklorist way of reading Native identity. And she's doing it through film. Perfect. Let's go there. If you're a Native person and you're reading this from a decolonial perspective, you're reading it on the rights of self determination and repositioning the identity. I'm sorry, you're repositioning the socio-political nature of sovereignty for your rights of self-determination on a decolonial position, which means that that coloniality does not exist for the way that you view the networks and relationships of tribal and Indianness. In doing so, you're able to not rely upon storytelling, but you're able to rely upon a narrative, history, and histories, and the plurality that exists within inside of it. That's where this is all going. You see the big difference with this? This article rocks, just to like throw it out there. And this is going to be way, way, way too much fun because I've only gotten this up to page 3. And if you catch that far, with where we're going, you're already like in bonus track. I mean, but take a look at the beginning of the things. Particularly take notice of David James's allegories of cinema that she mentions on page 4. She brings up blood quantum again here on page 5, but she presents it as an insider and a settler relationship. So be careful attention when you read that. She brings up the famed Stuart Hall here on the bottom of page 4, going into page 5, which like rocks the boat. She drops a bunch of different, film and film representations on you in page 6, going into what is going to be the beginning in the middle of page 6, where it says sound, songs, and the narrative presence in smoke signals. And that is where we're going to pick up next time because this is just way too killer. You have any questions? Shoot me an email. Let's talk about all this. Here we go.